Okay, so we are going to talk about not just mobility, but also sustainability and mobility. Just very, very quick introductions. Pam Fletcher is the VP of Global Innovation with Research and Development Laboratories at GM. Franz Reiner is the chairman of the management board with Daimler Mobility. And Felita Reynolds, who already got a couple of shout-outs, is the general manager with the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. Thank you three for being here. So this wasn't on my list of topics necessarily, but I feel like I have to ask this in light of some of the comments we heard from the earlier interview. So this goes to Pam and Franz. I believe your businesses were called bad businesses. A penny a mile, I mean, just talk about the traditional car business and what it looks like today. Was that a fair assessment?
What I would say is it's a perfect lead-in for what are we trying to do at General Motors and with innovation. And so we're ultimately using technology-driven business transformation, finding adjacent business models to our core, which is what John was referring to, our core business of designing, building, selling cars, trucks, and crossovers, and really taking us from Auto 1.0 into Auto 2.0. So we see a bright future. We're excited about the opportunities that technology is enabling to solve many problems in cities and with our individual customers around the globe.
As far as how the transition is going, how would you assess that part of it?
I do believe that that we started at Daimler very early, some of that transitional process. For example, in 2009, we were the first ones to start the car sharing operations with Car2Go in Germany. And in 2012, we started a multimodal platform called Movil at that time, now ReachNow. And we understand that there is a transformation happening coming from the customer base and also then from an engineering perspective. So we are facing that all together, and therefore we need to make sure that we talk more about it. Maybe that is the issue, because we have a lot to say and we have a lot to bring to the table.
And I want to definitely get back to some of the learnings that you've had along the way, because you guys did start very early on in this space. When you talk about sustainability and mobility, obviously there are different ways of coming at it, because there's the environmental and societal aspect to it, which is huge. And there's economic, business model sustainability. And I want to talk about both. But Salita, I'm interested to hear from your perspective. You wrote a while back about Lyft and Uber and other ride-sharing endeavors that instead of filling empty seats in cars, they created empty seats on public transport. Can you talk a little bit about, from the city of Los Angeles' perspective, and you've worked in other cities as well, including San Francisco, talk to us about where you see sustainability as these services stand today, and whether they are contributing or in some ways hindering cities.
So I think it's, first of all, fair to say that when ride-hailing launched in California, it was a good wake-up call for anybody who works in public transit, for people who deliver transportation on demand, transportation for hire, because what that industry did and what those companies did so successfully was to really iron out a lot of the pain points that people had. But simultaneously, there's this idea that my good friend Elon Musk likes to ridicule on Twitter of induced demand, which is that when you make it easier to drive, people drive more. Mm-hmm. And that affects everything that we think about in transportation. If your goal is to have people drive less, which would get us tremendous return on investment on everything from climate to safety and all these other things, tremendous challenges we're trying to beat, then creating a system that makes it easier for people to ride or to drive is not necessarily going to intuitively lead to those ends. And there may be a long game play where the availability of ride-hailing allows people to maybe step away from, plug your ears, personally owned vehicles. That might happen, but the jury is sort of out on that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there is now, the other problem we wrestled with for so long is that we could not get verified data about how these things were operating in cities for a really long time. And it's only in the very recent past that we've had some excellent work from UC Davis and University of Kentucky and a lot of our academic partners doing original research to start to make transparent how these things are actually transforming mobility. On the positive side, they do a much better job of serving people equitably. So in Los Angeles, if you are a black or brown person who calls a taxi, you are going to wait longer and you are more likely to be passed up. That's still somewhat true in ride hailing, but to a much, much smaller extent. But at the same time, where these things launch, there is a sort of a connection with decreasing ridership on public transit and even increasing driving, which always leads to increases in severe and fatal crashes, particularly for people walking.
What, you mentioned how you started in this space and with different experiments quite a while back. I assume that means that you've managed to collect a lot of data and you've been very global also from the get-go. So what have some of the learnings been along the way? What has the data showed you about consumer behavior?
I think, picking up on what Selena said, I do believe that we need to open up and we need to think about partnerships. That's maybe the modern word. We should not just think about car selling. We should not just think about ride hailing. We should not think about just car sharing. I think the platform needs to be created, and that needs to be created amongst cities, amongst urban environment, amongst car industry, amongst Lyft, Ubers, and FreeNow, for example, to make sure that we understand all of these data points jointly together, and then we can orchestrate, for sure, a much better service for our customers in urban cities. Yes, we want to sell cars, and yes, you need transportation to get people from A to B, and we're lucky that we're selling also buses. So I think we can offer not just the hardware, we can also offer the software. And ReachNow is a platform where we truly believe that this can be a good solution to the cities. But it needs to be jointly developed, it needs to be jointly understood, and it's not mine or yours, it's ours then at the end, and that's where I do believe we can make an impact.
And can you explain ReachNow real quick, because I know you've recently kind of reorganized and refocused and actually pulled out of some cities, so just explain what it is today as it stands.
Well, we pulled out of cities with ShareNow, so on the car sharing side.
Sorry.
Because they were not profitable.
It's a good reason to pull out of a city.
Yeah, well, right. And sometimes also the cities didn't want us, but that's a different story.
That's when you know you've made it.
Yes.
If you're a Silicon Valley company.
Yeah. But on the ReachNow side, to get to your question, on the ReachNow side, what it does, it's combining all of the needs of the customers. Either you take a public transportation, you use a car sharing, you use a ride hailing, you use a scooter or whatever, or a tube in a city. And I think this is something where if we do that right, jointly together, we will make a better impact. The customer needs to buy into that. And I think that's when we had a discussion at the table. Yeah, we need to formulate a joint goal towards the customer, and then you can sell a value proposition. If we just go out there and say, you want to fix this, and we want to fix that, and we want to sell more cars, you know, it's a competition going on, and I don't believe that's going to be helpful.
Well, can I just add quickly one thing, which is that you said, which is really important. In Los Angeles, you can get to about 12 times as many jobs in an hour by car as you can in an hour by transit. So owning a vehicle or having access to a vehicle is an absolute must for economic mobility. So while we talk a lot about driving down, pun intended, vehicle miles traveled and decreasing driving, we cannot do that with overlooking the fact that we are leaving a lot of folks behind who can't afford to own a car. And teasing apart auto access from auto ownership is really important, and technology is an enabling factor, and so are partnerships.
Right.
So my take on this is, you know, there's a lot of detailed points being made there, but you know, this is an industry under tremendous disruption right now, which frankly makes it a tremendously exciting time. And so we see a vision at General Motors of zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion. And if ultimately we take that as an approach to having more sustainability for not only cities but for our customers, and then develop all of the underlying things that have to happen. Because before we get to, not before, but to get to platforms to operate these things on, first, let's get to vehicles that are safe, right? That prevent injury, that people don't have crashes in, and provide a much healthier environment for us to all live in. Let's get to vehicles that ultimately provide zero emissions, yet are still fun to drive. I could talk about that part a little bit. And then let's get to solutions for some of this congestion. And it's going to take all of these things in order to make this, what I think you're trying to articulate come true in the future.
So much of what we're talking about applies to urban areas, and there are so many opportunities there and challenges. How do you guys look at more rural, suburban opportunities, because you do serve consumers in those areas?
That's a great question. And the reality is we have to work on all of those solutions. And so, conversations generally always want to go to quote, level 5 autonomous in very urban areas. But the reality is we need solutions that solve intra-city, that solve, traveling in and out of cities, that solve problems traveling cross suburb. And so, one example I would give is we're simultaneously, and I love the show out here.
Not distracting at all.
Simultaneously, developing what we would call the revolutionary approach to driving and the evolutionary approach to driving. And so the revolutionary approach, getting to fully autonomous vehicles to be rolled out initially in on-demand rideshare services at the same time, and I think John was making this point as well, at the same time developing very sophisticated driver assistance systems for people that do have to drive more miles, that maybe go cross-suburb or in rural areas. And so all of those are people that have mobility needs that have to be served.
Anything to add, Franz?
I would agree and also say that it's not easy to apply one process to every rural area in the world. If you go into different countries, public transportation, for example, in Germany, is very well known. A lot of people use it. So you have the situation that you have to supply private driven cars to a train station. You have to make sure that there is a parking space, and people then go into the city with the train or with the bus. That's a little bit of a different setting. You need to understand that. You have to understand the complexity. But once you have all of that together with the autonomous driving, I truly believe then that could be the key, to some of the issues we have in rural or in urban environment.
And you actually, I think, mentioned scooters in passing earlier. What the hell's going on in LA? Have any of you live in LA or been to LA recently, Andrew? Okay, the scooters. This is the largest scooter pilot of any city. And I was there just a few months ago and was tripping over scooters. So how's it been?
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. Totally chill. It has not occupied the greater part of my professional life for a year and a half. So here's the thing. People need choices. And that is really what it comes down to. And Lord have mercy, people need choices in Los Angeles, because I think about 65 or so % of all the trips made in the city, now here I'm not just talking about work trips, I'm talking about all trips, are shorter than 5 miles.
I thought you were going to say are done by scooter today, which would be really an amazing pilot.
Maybe. But 85% of them are people driving by themselves in their cars, right? And so these trips are where, if we could just give people better choices and set the table with better infrastructure and better street design, we have a shot, and we know how to do that. And so I felt, one of the things I felt strongly about was I did not want to put my finger on the scale. I did not want to artificially deflate the market. I wanted every company who wanted to come to Los Angeles to be able to come and to compete. And in order to do that, I needed to create a system that allowed me to manage the largest fleet of scooters and the largest mix of companies anywhere in the world. Because I have a job as a regulator, in the same way that I operate the streets and that I plan and build things on the streets, I also regulate private companies that are providing services on the streets. So we created a way of doing that was really meant to be the beginnings of kind of the connective tissue between the physical and digital public realms, called the Mobility Data Specifications. And man, all holy hell broke loose. So it's been very exciting because I've gotten to see a tremendous success and adoption of those scooters, on track for 19 million rides in 1 year. Majority of those trips are those short trips. They're solving a real problem, but what they're not doing is deploying in low-income neighborhoods that don't have other choices and where folks may not be able to afford to own a vehicle. And what they're not yet doing is sort of the market's not sorting itself out quite yet. And so what you experience is some chaos on the streets. And when they first launched, I would get all these emails from constituents and folks who lived in LA with, in all caps about, scooter get-in and scooter apocalypse, and they would say—
I think my colleague Andrew sent one of those.
Please see attached photos. And they would send me these photos, and I would be ready for just something awful. And it would be this innocent little scooter sitting on a landscape strip in the shade of a tree on the sidewalk in front of their house. And so I think part of that was just that, people have a really hard time with change.
Yeah.
And in order to get folks to get comfortable with all of these new ideas and all of these new technologies, there does need to be an adult in the room that people can turn to and look to register their complaints, to give input, and to see that reflected in the way that we manage the system. But the real goal that we have in mind is I want those companies to be phenomenally successful because we desperately need more choices.
And it may not have been entirely a smooth process over the last year, but it's an effort at doing this a different way, right? And partnering among the city, between the city and the private sector. Any thoughts that you two have on what you've learned on how to collaborate better? Because there are so many stakeholders here with these new services.
On cities?
Yeah, on cities, on entering cities, on how you collaborate between all of the different parties involved.
I mean, I mentioned our starting point with our Car2Go and Today Share Now. 2009, that is just one example. Understanding the cities is extremely important because every city, there are big cities in the world, but all the big cities are not the same. And they have different needs, they have different ideas, how they want to deploy some of the services. And I think this is something where the cities, they can help each other if they come to a common ground, at least to share one goal. And if we jointly maybe develop something like that, that would help everyone, and at the end, the customer. So understanding the city, knowing who to talk to, knowing what the service needs to look like, I think that is what we have learned in the past, and we're still learning. Yeah.
Market research, okay. Yeah. That makes sense. Anything to add, Pam?
I would just say that I think that, if we really keep the user, the customer, the end person right in front of us with all of these, whether they're pilots, full-scale pilots, or whether they're actual commercial deployments, I think that will lead us to solving the pain points that matter to people, and hopefully and those pain points roll up when you have more people in a city, roll up to big issues with cities. Franz, at your point there are many cities out there, and they are all unique. And I think, at this point, we're all working toward understanding these pain points and what are the building blocks, or what are the building blocks that ultimately can be put together, maybe in a little bit different ways, depending on which particular city you're in and how you're trying to solve those particular commuters' problems. So a lot of work to be done there. I think that there's been some great strides so far we have deployed Maven, which is, it's provided car share, it's provided Maven Gig, which gives an opportunity for gig drivers to be able to actually go into that business with readily accessible vehicles, and then even peer-to-peer. And it's going to take all of those types of pilots and deployments to really sort out the solutions that I think are going to pave the way for the future.
We can take a very, very quick question from the audience if somebody would like to. Oh, perfect. The microphone is right next to you. Can we get a weather question? Weather
No,
related
it's not
again?
a weather
No.
question, but so the question is, what's the fatality rate on scooters per million miles compared to automobiles? And also, have you thought about subsidizing scooters in the poorer neighborhoods?
So the
Thanks
answer
for lightening the mood.
to the so the answer to the first question is that we have had 0 fatalities in Los Angeles on scooters in the first year, and thank you. The severe injuries that we track are a very small. It's like 0.01% of the overall severe injuries that we're seeing in the city. We have a public health crisis on our hands when it comes to safety, especially in cities, especially in Los Angeles. 250 people die every year on the streets that I manage and operate. About half of those people are people on foot. And many of them are dying because the cars that are on our streets now are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And people are able to go faster, and they're also increasingly distracted by the amount of technology that the consumer wants in the vehicle. So when we start talking about safety, I think we could have a really robust conversation about it because it's a critical issue, and I take it very seriously, whether it's scooters or people driving or people walking, no matter how they travel. Dying when you're going from A to B ought not be an accepted outcome of the way that we've designed our transportation system,
And
for
Salita,
sure.
just very, very briefly, because we are about to wrap up, but in terms of subsidizing, you do have some incentives in place for lower income.
Yeah, it's
bringing
way
scooters
cheaper
to
for
lower-
them to deploy, but they're still not doing it. And so now we are thinking about what are the models that we could put in place. How could we begin to invest in, car sharing, for example, or other forms of which are extensions of public transit, as long as they're sort of deployed in the way that we're hoping to see them deployed, because it's a crying shame when car sharing comes out of a city because it's no longer profitable. That was a real choice for a bunch of people that are now stranded. We invest in public transit because it returns a public good, and we need to start expanding that definition.
Well, I didn't get to ask whether it really is harder to design a Mercedes than a Chevy, but thank you guys so much for being here. And please enjoy your main course.